You're tuning into the Dworkin Report. I'm Scott Dworkin, and today we have New York Times bestselling author and writer of How Project 2025 Will Ruin Your Life on Substack. Welcome, my guest, Andra Watkins. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Scott. How are you?
It's been a chaotic few weeks. We had absolutely scheduled this a few weeks ago, and then there was that busy weekend, obviously, with the attempt on Trump's life, and then there was the change of candidacy between Biden and Kamala Harris. So this is I think it's good timing. It's safe timing for us to be up to date and relevant events to make sure that this is evergreen from now on.
I'm glad to be here.
No, I appreciate it. And how? So I guess let's get started with like, how did you, as a writer, like, how did you get started in writing in the first place? Like, what motivated you to get into writing?
Um, I turned 40 in 2009 and I had a consulting practice. I studied accounting in college because I had to study something useful for my Christian nationalist parents to be happy. And so I made more money than I ever made in my life in 2008. And in 2009, I made $10,000 and turned 40 and had a big midlife crisis. And that's when I started writing. I'd always wanted to be a writer, but I was told I couldn't do anything useless like that. I needed to get a degree where I could stay home and keep my children and work part-time after they went to kindergarten. So I was a good Southern girl and did what my parents said. So I started writing in 2009 for public consumption, and my first book was published in 2014.
Wonderful. And so you had, what was your first book about?
My first book is my favorite book. Oh, I'm so glad I get to talk about it. It's called To Live Forever, An Afterlife Journey of Meriwether Lewis. It is not my New York Times best-selling book, but it is a paranormal historical thriller that hangs Meriwether Lewis up in between life and death, and he gets to have this adventure with this little girl on the Natchez Trace. I became fascinated with the founding of our country in my 30s because I grew up in Christian nationalism in a Southern church and school in rural South Carolina. It was one of the first members of Jerry Falwell Sr.'s Moral Majority. So the history that I learned was printed by Bob Jones University Press. And so it was Christian nationalist history that you're hearing them quote all the time. America was founded as a Christian nation. It was founded as a white Christian nation because white Europeans came here to settle and practice their religion. Slaves were happy on the plantation and their masters only punished them when they were bad. That kind of crap. And all of the founders were Christians and they all believed the Bible and the Constitution is steeped in the Bible. That's the history that I learned. So in my 30s, I started reading real history about the founding of our country. And that was kind of what started me down this road of deprogramming all of that Christian nationalist indoctrination that I had had as a child and in my teens. So it's been a very interesting journey.
Understood. You penned a Newsweek piece titled "I'm Childless Because of a Far-Right South Carolina Church." Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, that piece I wrote the day that South Carolina outlawed abortion last year. And I spent all day crying. So it's quite emotional. I mean, I can't be pregnant anymore. It doesn't impact me, but telling that story was for all the people who can be pregnant that it will impact. Because I grew up in this very anti-abortion climate. We did watch the blood-soaked anti-abortion videos. I was probably in elementary school when we started watching those. So while I didn't know what sex was, never had sex education, never knew how babies happened, but I saw all this bloody stuff in chapel services and at church services as a kid. And so I had to tell myself as a kid, the worst thing that could ever happen to me would be to get pregnant. If I get pregnant, I will humiliate my parents. I will be humiliated. I will be dragged across the platform at church, which was like 2,000 people. It wasn't a small church, and called a slut and whore. I will be, kicked out of my Christian school. I will not be able to finish school. I will not be able to give up this baby for adoption because the consequence of me being a slut and a whore would be that I had to be the mother to the baby, even if I was 14 when it happened. So the way that I kept myself on the straight and narrow was to say, getting pregnant is the worst thing that can ever happen to me. And I would have that conversation with myself all the time. So when I married my good Christian husband, like I was supposed to at 23, a switch did not flip in my brain. And suddenly it was a miracle to be pregnant. You can't spend your formative years telling yourself it's the worst thing that can ever happen to you and suddenly change your mind about it. So I always viewed pregnancy as the worst thing that could ever happen to me. I was never able to flip that switch and look at being a mother as something that would be positive. And I directly blame that upbringing for that. And I don't want that for other people. One of the greatest things that came out of that article was I heard from parents who said, my daughter brought me this, red state parents. My daughter brought me this and said, this is where I am right now. And she's 19 and I'm putting her in therapy. And so had I had that then, maybe things would have turned out differently for me. But therapy was also bad and horrible. And you just needed to read the Bible and pray, and that fixed all your problems. So that wouldn't have been given to me either.
It's interesting how far reaching writing can go, and where it can be applied to, and how it can make a difference in everybody's life. But, one of the things that I've learned that's so impactful is when you give these personal stories, you put them into writing in the books. Like, what gave you the courage to kind of put things that are so personal in your writing, put yourself out there and whatnot? Because not everybody can be a New York Times bestselling author, but like to put yourself out there, I mean, it's a lot. I know personally, like me thinking like, I'm gonna make statements about Trump in 2016, like, maybe people will listen. At first, I was talking to myself, like, what gave you the courage to do that? Was there, like, a tipping point, or did you just go out and do it?
Well, the first book that we talked about, To Live Forever, happened because I started hearing voices in my head. And if you know novelists who write fiction, a lot of them will tell you that their characters talk to them and have these voices. It sounds very schizophrenic, but it's actually part of the creative process. So they would not leave me alone and until I wrote the book. And so I wrote that book, and then I walked the Natchez Trace Parkway where that book was set in 15-mile increments every day for 34 days. And my dad was my wingman because he was the only person who didn't have anything to do for 5 weeks. So he went along with me, but we'd never gotten along. He's that person in my life who just drives me insane. We all have at least one of those people, and we're usually related to him. So that trip with my dad changed our relationship. And that's the book that ended up being a New York Times bestseller. And I wrote that book not to talk about me. I don't really like to read memoirs very much. And I said I would never write one because I thought they were narcissistic and self involved. So, of course, I ended up writing one, and that ended up being my most successful book. But I wanted to encourage people to make memories before it was too late. And that book has been published in Korean. I've heard from people all over the world who have read it, who have said, because of you and your dad, this is the adventure that I had with this person, and this is how it changed our lives. And so it felt really good to share that story and see it impacting other people and their relationships. So, like you said, the value of telling your personal stories is that hopefully other people see themselves in them and see a way to improve their lives or improve their relationships or make changes because you revealed something vulnerable. They feel like they can be vulnerable themselves and make changes they need to make.
So, getting into a focus that you've made of your life right now, at least currently that I can see, and it's big time. Really impressed by it because I don't want to comb through the 900 plus pages I have, but I didn't want to. A lot of it is, legal speak. It seems very boring. and it's hard for a lot of folks to read. And so I've seen this thing, Project 2025, I guess starting with that, you've done a lot of work about that. Or like what for people who are listening that don't know what it is or have heard about it but don't really know, like what is Project 2025 and what are you doing in regards to that?
From the beginning, and I started this work in January, I have called Project 2025 a Christo fascist manifesto to transform our government from a democracy to a Christian nationalist theocracy. At the beginning, I was pretty much the only person who was calling it that. And I would do interviews like this, and people would say, "Are you sure you want to be that in your face? I mean, that's a little much, isn't it?" And Rick Wilson was probably the first person who interviewed me and said, "You're the only person who's talking about it this way. And that's why I wanted to interview you." And that was in April, I think. And now everybody's calling it that. So I'm glad that I was able to use my 2 decades of indoctrination in Christian nationalism to deconstruct that language that's hidden all over this document that nobody else was picking up on in the media. Nobody else was talking about the buried Bible verses that they have all over the place and Christian nationalist concepts that they have become very good over the course of the last 30 years or so at making sound benign and even appealing at times, but really are rooted in these Christian nationalist beliefs. I think Kevin Roberts said he was quoted in an article in The Guardian this week as saying that their religious language did not appeal to voters, and so they had to change it up to be more appealing to voters. And so I speak their language, so I'm able to tell readers what they really mean when they say things, and not just with Project 2025, but when Republican politicians say things like this Missouri representative said when he voted against rape and incest exceptions in their abortion ban, "Well, forced birth can be the greatest healing agent." And people on the left just, "What is the matter with him? What an awful person he is. How could he be so cruel?" But I was able to go, this is the biblical basis for why he's saying that. And it's even worse than what you think it is when you just think he's cruel, because, they worship Old Testament God, who is a vengeful, hateful smiter of all people who make him angry. And so Old Testament God gives these women these pregnancies to teach them a lesson or get their attention or draw them back to him and heal their relationship. And it's against Christian nationalist beliefs to interfere with God trying to teach a woman a lesson. So it's really important that people on the left understand what they mean when they say things, because we cannot defeat an enemy we refuse to understand. And so I'm glad that I've been able to use that indoctrination for something that I believe is very positive, and that it's teaching people who've never been exposed to that world how to view it differently, and how to exploit the weaknesses that are there once they understand what they're really saying.
Yeah, and it's so they have this roadmap. I've always seen investigating Trump since 2016 or so. I've always seen Trump to be the laziest person who's ever been in the Oval Office ever. So I can see a bunch of his former staffers get together with the Heritage Foundation. They draft this document and they're like, here's, a roadmap for you, and you can take credit for all this stuff, but this is kind of how you need to do it so you can do it right this time and you can have control over everything. So they have this Project 2025 that they printed out, they gave out copies to all their members or whatever they did, and then they distributed it, made a pretty website about it, and then, again, made the language so that it may not be understandable how dangerous it is. In like layman's speak, what are the most dangerous parts of this document? In regards to, what are the top lines in regards to like what is really dangerous about it?
Well, Project 2025 creates a dictatorship and makes the president a dictator, which the Supreme Court has already paved the way for. They were implementing Project 2025 when they made that ruling. So they want to gut the federal government of all power and give themselves power to rule over us with a Christian nationalist form of Sharia law. And we see that happening in red states because red states are so much further down the road to implementing Project 2025 than blue states are. So abortion bans are part of that, control of women, part of that. They say life begins at conception or fertilization, and they are going to protect life from conception to natural death. They say that repeatedly in the document. The traditional family, and that is the biblical definition, one man married to one unrelated woman who has as many children as God gives them without contraception. That is their vision of a family, and they sprinkle that repeatedly throughout the document. So obviously that means they will outlaw same-sex marriage. They believe anything that is not one man married to one unrelated woman with as many children as possible goes against the Bible. So I have even pointed out on my Substack that people who live together but choose not to get married would be discriminated against in this kind of society and government. Or single parents who are largely women would be discriminated against because they believe that is an inferior family unit that the Bible condemns. So I can't think of a person other than white Christian nationalist men that this document would not impact negatively.
And so it benefits mostly white dudes. And that is obviously not who needs to be the focus on everything right now. I mean, like it's baffling that they put it on paper, and I'm glad that Kamala Harris has been talking about it. Obviously, there's been a change in regards to who the candidate is for the Democratic nominee. The presumptive nominee, obviously, probably have it locked up. I think next week, early next week, Kamala will be. I think at the end of this week, she'll announce her VP pick, and they'll go on tour next week on a multi-state tour, probably in some swing states. Has Harris becoming the nominee changed the dynamic of how Project 2025 can be exposed and fought against? Has it brought a spotlight to it? Have they backed away from it? Like, what are they doing right? What do they need to be doing, to make sure that this isn't overlooked with all the changes that have been made?
Well, she's been talking about it a lot, and higher profile politicians have been as well. I mean, you've had Eric Swalwell on your program. Elizabeth Warren's done some seminar online meetings about it. So I know Democrats are trying to raise the profile of it. I even have Democrat people in Congress following my Substack. So hopefully they are applying what they're learning from me to their talking points where they feel like it might be useful and helpful with the American public and American voters. I think it's important to keep explaining to people what's in Project 2025. A lot of people don't know that the Heritage Foundation have been writing a document like this every 4 years since 1979. So they've had a lot of practice putting these documents together. And Reagan implemented over half of their policy positions in 1981 and in his first term in office. So every time they would get policy positions that they wanted implemented, they would move further to the right. And so Project 2025 is really their rim shot. It's their Hail Mary. This is everything we want to take over the government and transform it so that we will never lose power again in our lifetimes. And, Americans have never lived in an authoritarian regime. So it's hard to imagine what that might be like. But when Republicans are openly talking about restricting your right to travel, when they're openly talking about sealing the border, when they're openly saying women will not be able to travel between states without proving that they're not pregnant or not endangering a child, when they're openly saying that they're going to punish and round up and even execute their enemies, we should believe them and not think that they're just being hyperbolic. The lengths that they've been willing to go and the things that they've been willing to say are horrifying. And I regularly say people can accuse me of exaggerating or hyperbole or whatever, but I'm just telling you what they're saying. And I'm telling you what this document says. When they say they will outlaw and jail everybody for pornography, which is how I started talking about this, because to most people, pornography is their Pornhub or their dirty movies or whatever, they watch in the privacy of their own spaces. But growing up in Christian nationalism, everything is pornography. Everything that makes Mike Johnson think about sex is pornography. So a woman in a bathing suit is pornography, potentially, to a Christian nationalist man. All art is pornography. A lot of movies are pornography. The smart romance novels that I enjoy reading are all pornography, and so when you understand how all-encompassing, how we're all pornographers, either producers or consumers of it, it becomes a lot more sobering to think about living in a society like that, where I could go to jail for reading a smart romance novel.
That is horrifying. But for many reasons, I mean that is probably one of the best descriptions in the shortest amount of time that I've heard about Project 2025 and the dangers around it. That's why I want to have you on the show today, obviously. But is there something now, people who may be aware of it, is there something that maybe people nobody really knows about that you've tried to point out? I mean, it's so eerily similar. I remember when I was on an island in the middle of 2016, screaming about, I think Russia is using the internet to attack our civilians and use it to divide us. And everybody, my friends, even on the Hill, they're like, "What? Like what? It's seriously?" And then
Sounds like a conspiracy theory, Scott.
right, and then Malcolm Nance, who was on MSNBC at the time, was like, "Hey, I read your report. Like, this is some serious stuff." And then it went from there. Thanks to Malcolm and some other people I worked with before, and then all of it took off from there. But and then everybody was talking about it. But it really feels like you were in this, at the front of the pack, and then you were able to expose a lot of it. So I'm glad that you're still working on it and still focused on it and still professional in regards to it. Is there anything that people may not know that's just like uh that's in it that we may not know about that you want to point out?
The way Project 2025 treats science and expertise, which I haven't seen a lot of people talking about, is straight out of Christian Nationalism 101. Christian nationalists believe that we're only supposed to know things that God chose to reveal in the Bible, that the Bible is the complete amount of knowledge that we should have, that God created the world in 7 literal 24-hour days, or 6 literal 24-hour days, and rested on the 7th day, about 10,000 years ago, more or less. And so that is their approach to all things science. So Project 2025 calls for gutting the National Institutes of Health, which is our primary research arm for researching dangerous diseases, for finding cures for all kinds of ailments, not just in the United States, but worldwide. So they want to gut that entity and take it into the private sector, which The reason that the government can afford to do some of the work that it does is because it doesn't have to make money. Turning that over to the private sector would mean a lot fewer breakthroughs scientifically and from a healthcare perspective, which they believe is completely fine because, God chooses who lives and dies, and we really shouldn't be interfering with that at all. If it's your time to die, then it's your time to die because God says it is. They would also gut the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration because they're really angry that they study climate science and talk about climate change. And they want to do away with all that discussion because they don't agree with it. Because God's already said in the Bible that God's going to destroy the earth at the end of the world. So, we can't destroy the earth as human beings because that's against the Bible. So it's ridiculous that we're saying that and having scientists say that. So they would do away with NOAA. They would do away with the National Hurricane Center, which is like my Bible during hurricane season, living on the East Coast of the US. I much prefer the people there to the people screaming on TV about everything. So I don't want all weather to be privatized. I really love those people and feel like I get to know them really well by the end of hurricane season every year. So the way it would deal with science, the way that it would turn the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention into a surveillance unit to track people who are getting transgender surgeries, trying to get transgender treatments, pregnant. That is the arm that Project 2025 calls for to track all pregnancy outcomes nationwide. And so they would be criminalizing people who miscarry a lot of the time because miscarriages look like abortions. So people who are grieving and upset about losing a pregnancy could potentially be charged with a crime while they're grieving a child they wanted. So I haven't seen as many people talking about those kinds of real life medical scientific impacts that would impact a lot of Americans.
Right. And you can learn about this on Andra's page. But every week you share what brought you hope and ask for others to do the same. At the end of every interview, I ask our guests to give some words of hope and inspiration to those who, it's quite the transition here, who might need it right now. So the floor is yours. What can you say that can give us some hope right now? Somebody might need it.
I feel really energized. I'm excited about Kamala Harris as president. I can't wait to see who she picks as her vice president. I have my pick, but I don't think she's going to pick my pick, but any of them would be fine with me. I'm excited to see how energized this has made people on our side. And I believe we're going to win in November. I believe all of these various things that are falling into place are going to lead to a blue tsunami. And I'm proud to be fighting alongside so many people like you and others to make that happen.
Appreciate you.
I'm very hopeful.
As am I. Andra Substack is Project 2025 is theocracy.substack.com. The link will be in the episode's notes and everywhere else, and we'll make sure that your books and everything and links to that are out there. Andra Watkins, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate your time. Keep on doing the good work that you're doing, and I hope that really, really hope that it all pays off in the end because again, I didn't know that much about Project 2025 until I saw you writing about it and presenting it and reaching out to me and showing me what was good with it, what was bad with it in regards to nothing was good with it, but in regards to what what it entailed and how dangerous it
Now,
was.
you were a very early adopter. You were among my first readers, I think.
Yeah, well,
So,
again, you conveyed it very clearly how dangerous it was, and I appreciate that, and I can always, like I said, when I had my Russia report, there was somebody who just took a look at it and was like, "Whoa, this is serious, and this could be potentially bad, and it's pretty simple." in regards to how dangerous this is. So I appreciate your work and everything you do for our democracy and the fight for our future. So thank you again for joining me today and for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.